Welcome everybody. We'll get started in just a moment. Just give people a chance to get their audio settled in. That seems good. So welcome to today's webinar. Before I hand it off to our presenters for the day, I just want to cover a few logistics about this platform. This is Zoom webinar. At this stage, I'm sure many people are familiar with it, but just in case you're not, it differs from Zoom meeting in a couple primary ways. The first is that your cameras and your microphones are not enabled, so you don't have to worry about interrupting us, but it does mean you only have a few options for interaction. So during the actual presentation, if you have questions or comments, you can use the chat feature or the Q&A button on your dashboard there. For chat, just make sure that you type or select the all panelists and attendees button if you want everyone to see your message. Otherwise, only the panelists will see it. And if you use the Q&A function, everyone can see your question, although you can ask anonymously and they could add their own comments and upvote it if they want to. When we reach the open forum, the open discussion portion, you can also raise your hand and I'll just come and unmute you and then announce that you're unmuted. So if you want to speak during that portion, you can use the raise hand function. So without further ado, I want to hand it off to Cassandra Moore, our Group 5 president.
Good afternoon. I'm Cassandra Moore, your Vice President for Access and Equity on the AACRAO Board of Directors and the Director of Admissions and Enrollment Development at Anne Arundel Community College in Maryland. AACRAO is a strong supporter of diversity and diversity initiatives. Our LGBTQIA caucus strives to work for LGBTQIA rights and educate other higher education professionals so they can serve their students with an understanding of sexual orientation, gender identity, and gender expression. Thank you to Dr. Tammy Johnson and Chris Dorston, who serve as the caucus chairs. It is my pleasure to welcome you to the ABCs of LGBTQIA+ webinar led by two great creatives, Jack Miner, past president of AACRAO, and Stephen Smith, University Registrar at Adelphi University, and the founding father of Cap AACRAO, our state association. Let's get started.
Thank you, Cassandra, and welcome everyone. So I can't get my screen to work. Wait 1 second. There we go. So welcome everyone to the ABCs of LGBTQIA+. For many of us, our knowledge of LGBTQIA+ community may be solely based on what we see in pop culture. Over the last few decades, members of our community have been showing up in theaters and over the airwaves, but those characters don't always provide an accurate or complete representation. Now, for some, it may be based on what we see in the news media, like this photo from the New York City Pride Parade. But the media tends to focus on images, events, and stories that may not provide a full representation of life in the LGBTQIA+ community. So today, we hope to help you fill in some of those gaps. We will touch a little on history, we'll explain some symbols, and help you come to an understanding of some of the most common terms that are used today. Then we'll highlight some of the things that are happening on our campuses and talk a bit about how all this relates to what you can do on your campus. There are many LGBTQIA+ role models that you may know of from the world of sports and entertainment, such as trailblazing tennis star Billie Jean King, the first openly gay athlete to be drafted in the NFL, Michael Sam, multiple award-winning actors, Billy Porter and Laverne Cox, and media superstar Anderson Cooper. But also from government, from the first member of Congress to voluntarily come out as gay, Barney Frank of Massachusetts, to current Senator Tammy Baldwin from Wisconsin, Colorado Governor Jared Polis, Secretary of Transportation Pete Buttigieg, and Chicago Mayor Lori Lightfoot. But the two who arguably have been the most influential in the LGBTQIA+ rights movement, unfortunately did so after they were murdered. On the left is someone that probably most of you have heard of, or possibly even seen the Oscar-winning biopic starring Sean Penn, and that's Harvey Milk. Harvey Milk was born and raised on Long Island, but he moved to San Francisco during the migration there of gay and bisexual men in the early 1970s. As the community's influence grew, Milk, on his fourth try, got himself elected to city council, the San Francisco Board of Supervisors. Now, while his theatrical campaigns and his historic win and the passage of the bill he sponsored, which banned discrimination in public accommodations, housing, and employment, on the basis of sexual orientation. While these things began to gain him nationwide attention, he became an icon and a martyr to the gay community when he was assassinated along with San Francisco Mayor George Moscone in 1978. On the right is Matthew Shepard, who gripped the LGBTQIA plus community on October 7th, 1998, when he was discovered after being brutally beaten and left tied to a fence the night before in Laramie, Wyoming. Vigils were held for Matthew across the nation while it became clear that the men who had been arrested were motivated by his sexuality. After his death 5 days later, his mother, Judy, became a very prominent LGBTQIA plus activist. And in 2009, President Barack Obama signed into law the Shepard Byrd Hate Crimes Prevention Act, which was named for Matthew, along with James Byrd Jr., an African-American man who had been dragged to his death, also in 1998, in Texas by white supremacists. Now, an important part of our community's history are the LGBTQIA plus icons in pop culture over the years, from Cher and Barbra Streisand to Madonna and Lady Gaga, and even Diana, the Princess of Wales. But the most iconic and the one tied to the movement itself is none other than Judy Garland. Now, perhaps it was her rags to riches story or her struggle with body issues and suicide attempts, or the brilliant performances and high profile suffering and higher profile comeback, or the fact that her signature song is about a rainbow. But for whatever, Judy Garland attracted our community. As Time magazine described in 1967, a disproportionate part of her nightly claque is. Now, when asked in 1965, she minded having such a large gay following, she said, "I couldn't care less. I sing to people." Now, one influence that Garland has had on the LGBTQIA plus community is the term friend of Dorothy. Now, this alludes to her character in The Wizard of Oz, but it became a term that gay men used during the times when it was unsafe to be gay. If you wanted to find out if someone were gay without outing yourself, the secret code was to ask, "Are you a friend of Dorothy?" Now, although the use of this term is waning, I personally saw it in use often, even into the 2010s on cruise ships, where the daily itinerary would list a social gathering for Friends of Dorothy. Although most, if not all, have now changed that to be LGBT social. Now, there's also a myth that Judy Garland may have, after her death, sparked the gay rights movement. Over 21,000 people attended Judy Garland's funeral in Manhattan's Upper East Side on Friday, June 27th, 1969. Now included were dozens and dozens of gay people, drag performers, and members of the transgender community. And then that night, in the early morning hours of Saturday, June 28th, police raided, as they had done many times before, the Stonewall Bar in Greenwich Village. However, many believe that it was the strong emotions of those who had attended the funeral earlier that day and the friends who met them there at Stonewall to remember Garland that caused them to fight back that night against the police in what is now known as the Stonewall riots. The demonstrations continued throughout that weekend, and then again the week later, and activist groups were organized in response to these riots. And while we'll never know how much truth there is behind the myth that it was the emotion because of Garland's funeral that caused the Stonewall patrons to fight back that night, what is clear is that this was the beginning of the Pride movement, as organized marches were held beginning on the first anniversary of the riots and have, until last year because of COVID, continued without interruption on the last weekend in June, with over 1 million people attending the New York City's Pride Parade every year, including on occasion, as you can see in the bottom photo, yours truly. Now, in that last photo, you may notice the rainbow pride flag. Although it is the most recognizable symbol of the LGBTQIA plus community, one that predates it is the inverted pink triangle. Use in the United States began in the early 1970s as a symbol against homophobia, but its origins comes from the 1930s when it was used by the Nazis to label gay, bisexual, and transgender people whom they had imprisoned at concentration camps. However, in the late 1970s, Harvey Milk, among other gay activists in San Francisco, asked their friend Gilbert Baker to design a new symbol to represent pride and freedom, rather than the pink triangle, which symbolized oppression. Baker and 30 of his friends helped dye and stitch together 2 large rainbow flags that were then flown during San Francisco's Gay Freedom Day parade on June 25th, 1978. Baker's initial design had 8 colors, pink, red, orange, yellow, green, turquoise, indigo, and violet. Each color had its own specific meaning. When demand for the flags grew tremendously later that year in the aftermath of Harvey Milk's assassination, an inability to obtain enough, at first pink and then turquoise fabric, to mass produce these flags led to the modification to the current 6 stripes of red, orange, yellow, green, blue, and purple. Now, many subcultures in the LGBTQIA+ community have begun to adopt pride flags, and these are just some of those. Probably the most commonly seen one here is the one in the upper right corner, the blue, pink, and white transgender pride flag. Now, there have been other variations to the original rainbow pride flag, but this is one I've been seeing a lot recently. It's the standard 6-striped rainbow flag with a multicolored chevron on the left, the light blue, pink, and white from that transgender flag, as well as brown and black to represent people of color in the LGBTQIA+ community. Now, other common symbols that you might see are the Greek letter lambda, which has become an international symbol of gay liberation and gay rights, as well as the equal sign logo of the Human Rights Campaign, an organization that lobbies for protection and expansion of rights for the LGBTQIA+ community. Now, in 2013, the HRC redesigned a variation of their logo in red to specifically symbolize the fight for marriage equality. And finally, one symbol that's been popping up a lot in recent years is the unicorn. Now, it may be their mystical power or their otherness that have attracted them to the LGBTQIA+ community, or maybe it's how unicorns blur the lines between societal norms of masculinity and femininity. But of course, the link could be the link between unicorns and rainbows probably have something to do with it as well. Now, so far, you've heard me using the term LGBTQIA+ a lot. So let's talk a little bit about terminology. The terminology that has been used by our community has evolved a lot over the past 40 years or so. Early on, and in fact still evident if you watch any of the reruns of the old TV sitcoms of the 1970s, you'll see that the word homosexual was used widely. But however, as it became evident that this very clinical word was being used in a negative and pejorative manner, those in the gay liberation movement began using the term gay community, and then later, gay and lesbians, to bring attention to the similar yet different issues that are faced by women. Then the acronym GLBT began to appear to also recognize the struggles of bi and trans people. Then during the AIDS crisis of the 1980s, more women began to take leadership roles in the community. So to recognize their struggles, as well as to highlight the injustices within our own community, people began moving the L to the front. And by the late 1990s, LGBT had become the norm. Now from there are many variations, and many of you may see organized groups on your campuses with additional letters. Our caucus here at AACRAO has chosen LGBTQIA+, adding the letter Q for those who identify as queer, as well as those who may still be questioning. The letter I for those who identify as intersex. The letter A for a very important member of our community, our straight allies. And then the plus sign to be inclusive of all members of our community, regardless of how we identify. Now, in identifying those letters, I may have used some terms that you may not be familiar with. And as the plus sign indicates, there are many other ways that members of the LGBTQIA+ community identify. So let's talk about some of those now. And something important to keep in mind as we define some of this terminology is that we talk about this not to try to find ways to label people, but rather to understand the terms that people use so that we can gain a better understanding. So now let's start with some of those which you may be most familiar with. Heterosexual represents a male or female attracted to people of the opposite sex, more commonly referred to as straight. So this would likely be the identity used by those represented by the A in LGBTQIA+, our allies. A lesbian is a woman who's attracted to other women. The word gay can have a few meanings. Primarily, it means anyone who is attracted to someone of the same sex. But over the years, as the word lesbian has become more commonly used, gay is used more by men now than it is by women. Collectively, you'll often hear the term lesbian and gay men to represent the gay community. However, now on the other end of the spectrum, some people use the word gay very broadly to represent anyone who does not identify as heterosexual. Now, the word bisexual used to simply represent someone who is attracted to both males and females, but as we've come to recognize various identities, it's now used by many people to represent attraction to more than one identity. Now, I recently had a friend say to me that a gay friend once told her that there was no such thing as bisexual, that you either liked people of your own gender or you did not. Now, this unfortunate dismissive attitude is known as bi erasure. And it's a common misconception that bisexual people still sometimes face, even as you can see from members within our own LGBTQIA+ community. Being bisexual doesn't mean that you have to love all genders with equal distribution or even in the same manner as someone else who identifies as bi. You may have a preference for one gender. You may find that you're attracted to different genders in different ways. These are all feelings that should not be invalidated by others. As with any identity, the only thing you need to do to be bisexual is identify as bisexual. Transgender is a term that is used by those who identify with a gender different from that which they were assigned at birth. Now, in the past, you may have heard or even used the word transsexual to identify those who had gender reassignment surgeries, or maybe the word transitioning for people who were in the midst of that process. However, the use of these two words has declined. The distinction that these words bring is based solely on body parts. And frankly, private body parts are really no one else's business. So the word transgender has become an umbrella term used by any person who identifies with a gender different from that which they were assigned at birth. I think it's also important to note that not all people in this situation identify in the same way. While one person who was assigned male at birth but identifies as female now may consider themselves to be transgender, another person in the same situation may identify simply as female. So this is why pronouns are so important. Several years ago, I began really seeing this in use when I attended a few LGBTQIA+ functions on campus, and the students introduced themselves not only with their name, but with their pronouns. It's also becoming common for people to list pronouns in the pronouns that they use in their email signature. I personally do this. I think it's great because the more widespread it becomes, the more we break down that stigma that some may feel is attached to it. In addition to he, him, his, and she, her, hers, some pronouns that you might hear could include z's or zers or z's or zers. Although the combination that seems to be becoming the most prevalent is they, them, theirs. In fact, to demonstrate how English language is ever evolving, where we once would have said that it was grammatically incorrect to say something like, a student must complete their form because it was mixing singular and plural, many universities like mine are now including in their style guides that this is now the preferred usage, to say they rather than say he or she, or to say their rather than to write his/her. In fact, although the use them as singular is still catching on, I've noticed that Gmail now accepts the word themselves as being a correct word. Although it seems Microsoft Word still autocorrects it to themselves. Now, I stated earlier that our caucus had added the letter Q to represent two groups, those who identify as queer or questioning. Questioning represents people who are still in the process of discovery and exploration, still unsure of their orientation or identity. Queer is a word that was once used exclusively as a slur, but it has been reclaimed by many as an umbrella term to represent anyone whose identity falls outside of societal norms. However, because of its derogatory history, some people, even within the LGBTQIA+ community, still find it uncomfortable using the word. Intersex is an identity that represents people who are born with variations in physical features that don't fit doctors' expectations of the male or female body. These variations could include things like chromosomes, hormones, or internal and external genitalia. About 1 in every 200 people has an intersex variation, which is about the same as the number of people who have red hair or green eyes. Now, sometimes these variations are undetected at birth when the doctor is assigning the sex. Sometimes when it is detected, the doctor and or the family may just make a decision on which sex to assign. Often, intersex children don't know about these variations until later in life, such as when they reach puberty or even when they reach adulthood when they're trying to have a baby. A problem that the intersex community has brought more awareness to is this practice of performing surgeries or hormone treatments on infants and children before they are able to even have a say in this decision themselves. So now that we've talked about the LGBTQI and A, let's talk a little bit more about the plus. Now, as I mentioned earlier, this is meant to be inclusive of all members of our community, regardless of how we identify. So let's talk about some of these more commonly heard terms and what they mean. One word that's relatively new to me in the last couple of years, and in fact, just added to Webster's dictionary in 2017, is cisgender. This word represents someone whose gender identity is the same as the sex they were assigned at birth. Now, this is not representative of sexuality, meaning gay or straight, but rather biological sex and gender. Non-binary is an umbrella term used by people who identify outside the male-female binary. Other terms that are used by this group sometimes include genderqueer or androgyne. Now, not to be confused with the term bisexual, which is attraction to two or more genders, are the terms pansexual and omnisexual. Both represent an attraction to people regardless of their gender, but omnisexual characterizes attraction to someone despite their gender, while pansexual characterizes attraction to someone without regard to their gender, sometimes also referred to as gender blind. Now, not to be confused with pansexual and omnisexual, which identify sexuality, is gender fluid, which deals with gender. This identity is used by people who do not feel limited by one gender, but rather experience changes in gender identity. And finally, you may be familiar with the term asexual, which represents someone who experiences little or no sexual attraction. But people who experience low amounts of attraction or attraction only under certain conditions may identify as gray sexual. These are just a few of the ever-growing list of terms that represent gender identities and sexual orientations that make up the plus in LGBTQIA+. And as I mentioned at the beginning, the objective here is not to figure out ways to label people, but rather seek an understanding of the terms that people use. And it's important to recognize that people use identifiers that make them feel comfortable. It's not up to someone else to say that their identifier is wrong or inaccurate. And regardless of how people identify, we should recognize their struggles and celebrate our pride together. So now we're going to switch gears slightly, and Jack is going to talk some about how all of this relates to you and your university. Jack?
Well, thanks. First, really great presentation, Steve. It was wonderful being able to follow you, and always love getting to work with you and Cassandra. I do want to call out one thing from Steve's presentation that may get missed, and I would specifically call this out because of AACRAO. One of the people that you highlighted in the politicians is a guy named Jared Polis. And Jared is now governor of Colorado, but for a number of years was a US representative, and has actually been a very, very good friend of AACRAO through the years. And so I wanted to call out the connection that we have with him. A few years ago, we actually did a FERPA update piece of legislation that allowed a little bit more flexibility around the interpretation of FERPA. And he was actually the lead legislator that worked with us on not only drafting that, but also introducing that to Congress. And we all got to be there when he did that. So I was literally sitting in his office when he was on the floor introducing that piece of legislation for us. So again, a really, really great connection to the community and a really great connection to a leader. When we were putting this presentation together, one of the things we wanted to make sure that we did was put some reference in as how this could be relevant at your institutions. So we wanted to make sure that we are providing some education that was really giving you a broader sense of the community, but also wanted to make it relevant for your role. And I think when some of you have probably seen presentations we've done with AACRAO before and that different AACRAO leaders have done around recruiting LGBTQ plus students, others working with records, things like that. But one of the things that I think I want to really stress about the presentation today, and I think especially following up Steve's presentation, is how much is new and how much of an evolving conversation this has been. And so one of the things that I would say that is different now than what we would have probably said a few years ago is the connection with your own campus community and with your students. I think a few years ago when we gave presentations, we talked a lot about best practices and talked about things that were happening at different institutions across the country and how you could interpret that for your own university. And one of the things that I would warn everybody against is that's probably going to be really stale. So by the time you hear about something that somebody else is doing or hear about another university's journey, it's probably not going to be relevant to your institution. So I think one of the things that I really recommend that you do is think about those presentations, think about that information you have, but then talk to your own campus community and talk about what the lived experiences of your own students and about what that demographic is, because that's going to be very different for you. And even something like the conversation around pronouns, that's one that has definitely evolved over the years and is definitely different from a generational standpoint. When I started that conversation with the university I was at a few years ago, our students absolutely had no interest in pursuing pronouns at all. And at that point, they were considered preferred pronouns and designated pronouns. And now it's really considered pronouns. It's not your preference, it is your pronoun. You don't need anybody's permission to make it your pronoun, it is your pronoun. And I think now as the student demographic has changed and as that's become more comfortable in society and more present, more and more students have that as an expectation. I think one of the things that having that conversation with your students and your student leaders is really an opportunity to think about what does that look like for your institution around a whole variety of topics. One of the things that I also think is really important is think about the change that we've seen over time. And again, I think working with these communities over the last few decades, one of the things that I think for me has really changed is initially, we did a lot of conversations around creating a sense of community and creating a sense of place for LGBTQ students. Now, I think we're at a point where we see that students not only want a place created, not only want that sense of space and want that community, but they also want that opportunity for integration. And I use that integration very specifically. It's not assimilation. So it's not that they want to mix into a larger community and lose their identity. They want to retain their identity. They want to retain the culture that is the LGBTQ community, but they want to do that in a larger setting and mix that, that sense of community from just us and everybody. And I think that's a really great distinction. And I think that really changes a lot of the things that you end up seeing. I think the other thing that we end up seeing is when you look at the community, especially when we think of things like gender fluid, questioning, we see a much larger portion of the community and especially the student community that starts to identify that way. So again, 10, 15, 20 years ago, when we would survey students about who identifies as gay, lesbian, bisexual, it was a relatively small number. As we're starting to broaden what those questions are and broaden the opportunities for students to be able to self-identify, we're starting to see a larger population of students that will raise their hand and say, I am questioning, or I do not identify as one gender or the other. And it's a really great opportunity to think about what that means from your campus community. And I think that really changes our expectations as a university. Part of what we end up having to think about is making sure that we have the foundation available for our students. And that ends up being largely around our policies and the way that we practice those policies to create a campus culture. again, reflecting back a few years, we would have largely had conversations about making sure that your campus has a non-discriminatory policy. Now that's just an expectation. If you don't have a non-discrimination policy that covers sexual orientation, gender identity, you are so far behind the times that you really need to catch up as an institution. It's probably hurting you in a number of ways, including with funders, et cetera. Now you really need to be thinking about your policies as being affirming. And the conversation that I always like to have with people that are setting up new programs is to think about the same conversations that you have around race and ethnicity, and welcoming those communities, making sure those communities feel welcome, but also thinking about what you're trying to do. When I think about the posture of my institution, we are frequently trying to change the world, and we're trying to change the world by lifting up communities, by providing communities an opportunity to move forward and to change the history and to be able to correct things that have happened in history. And so that's often an opportunity to provide opportunities, to provide support services that are really targeting bringing groups of students into our community. And in the same way that we try to recruit African-American students and Latino students, we are now trying to recruit LGBTQ plus students into that community as well. Partially because that adds to our diversity, but it also ends up being an opportunity to really move those communities forward and increase the number of people within those communities that have degrees. Part of what you need to end up thinking about in that scenario is your campus community welcoming? And are you doing all of the things to welcome students in that way? So things like, are you providing a welcoming opportunity in the classroom? And those conversations around things like pronouns are an opportunity to start a conversation around education, but it's also, frankly, an opportunity to see where your weaknesses are. One of the things that has happened at a number of universities is they've started down a process of collecting pronouns, for example, but not accompanied that with a pronoun policy. So you end up with a scenario where a faculty member, a bad actor, says, I am not going to observe your pronoun. I am going to call you by whatever I want to call you and what gender I think you are. And that's been an opportunity for universities to, I think, have a huge wake-up call that everybody is not marching uniformly towards acceptance. And it's an opportunity for you to think about, how do you create culture opportunities to educate, to be able to address those issues, and to recognize that it's part of the value that you're living as an institution, and that the institution is standing behind this community. And it's not a case where it's just the community fighting for themselves. It's really part of the institutional value. And when we think about that, one of the things that I always like to have people focus on is to live your values. And I think this, again, is a different expectation from universities than we had a few years ago. So a few years ago, there was an expectation that universities didn't discriminate against gay and lesbian students, and I'll use that group very narrowly. But now there's an expectation that universities are making a bold statement, and making a bold statement that the students are welcome. We're taking stances in the community. We're taking stances that this is part of an educated society, to be welcoming to others, to embrace diversity, to embrace the differences, and to be respectful of these communities. And in many of our institutions, in addition to the commitment we have for education, in some cases, we have a land grant mission as well, to specifically educate the people of our state or the people of our region. And this is an opportunity to really think about, how do we share those values and share the importance of diversity and the importance of different communities within that voice that we give to the larger community of education. So some of the things around visibility and what expectations are now. One is thinking about your communications, thinking about what your campus messages are. So making sure that you're inclusive in your language, making sure that you take opportunities to welcome people. So recognize that we're at a point now where many of our parents are gay and lesbian parents who are now raising kids that we adopted or had years ago that are now college age, and they're now going to college. So your campus tours are not just a male-female parent relationship anymore. And so thinking about that in your communications, thinking about how you as a university can stand up for communities. So things like sponsorships. Is it an opportunity for you to sponsor your local human rights campaign dinner? Is it an opportunity for you to sponsor your local pride rally or your local pride march? The universities that I've been at have always been sponsors of pride celebrations, have always been sponsors of other community events. Some of the other things that happen that are opportunities for you to be present is for your president to be vocal and for your president to be visible at events and with the LGBTQ plus community. But there are other things as well. For example, one of the things that is very common now is for mascots, cheerleaders, sports teams from universities, especially large named universities, to be part of pride celebrations to show that that's part of the value commitment of the university. It is very common expectation for the university president and trustees and senior leadership to be part of pride celebrations and other celebrations happening through the year. A number of professional as well as college sports programs participate in a program called If You Can Play, You Can Play, that really focuses on out LGBTQ athletes and making sure that they're feeling welcome within that community. One of the things that we've seen more recently, and again, I try to always create this comparison, many of our institutions, if not most of our institutions, closed Friday for Juneteenth. Many of us figured that out at 5:30. For those of you that are kind of leaders on your university, you had to scramble and figure that out at 4:30 and 5 o'clock on Thursday afternoon. How are you going to make that happen? That was a really important symbol to the African-American community, but that was also a really important symbol of our values. Not just that it became a federal holiday and that we were following that up, but that the universities that responded felt that it was so important that we were going to scramble to make sure that happened this year. Hopefully, we had our ducks in a row and we had already been planning some recognition for Juneteenth. So we were able to add to that versus create something from scratch. That's been a really good reminder to think about how you do that same thing for the LGBTQ community. I shared an example on the slide of something that my own institution did. We have a phenomenal opportunity that, as Steve mentioned earlier, a number of folks have been married in the past couple of years. And one of the symbols that he shared was a symbol that really helped push along the awareness of gay marriage and marriage equality. And the couple that was actually the landmark case for that are both University of Cincinnati graduates. So we've used that as an opportunity to really celebrate them, to celebrate our alumni, but also to celebrate our community. And it's something that's been a really great conversation starter within the state, within the region, to be able to think about what that relevance is. Every institution has something that is that opportunity. That's a really good one. I get it. But every institution has something that you're able to celebrate as part of that day. One of the things that a prior institution that I had been at did every year for National Coming Out Day, and again, this somewhat dates me too, was we still had a student newspaper that had a pretty large circulation. We did a full 2-page centerfold ad every year for National Coming Out Day that had every name of every university employee that supported the LGBTQ community. And it started as kind of a grassroots issue that grew into a pretty large fundraiser that actually raised about $40,000 to $50,000 a year in scholarship funds for LGBTQ scholarships, because it became something that everybody started sponsoring. Think about all of those opportunities, because again, that's an opportunity for the institution to signal their values. And that's really important in making sure that your students feel welcome. Again, going back to that scenario, it's a really great opportunity to build your culture and to also signal to people who aren't part of the LGBTQ community that this is who we are. And that if you are that bad actor faculty member, it's a good sign that we're not going to tolerate that that is not who we are as an institution. And without a disciplinary conversation, you signal that you need to think differently. You need to open your mind. You need to think about how do we support our students and how do we move forward within the values that we've created. Part of that ends up also starting to give you an opportunity to think about how do you recruit more students to your university. You know, one of the things that we all are trying to do is grow our enrollment. And this is a great community to be able to grow your enrollment from a diversity standpoint, but also from a standpoint of being able to really embrace an opportunity for students that not every university actively goes after. So think about how you build your admissions materials. One of the things that is very frequent now is you will build in things where there's some of the LGBTQ plus symbolism that Steve mentioned earlier. It's very common when you talk about the city that you're in to talk about the Pride celebration in the same way that you talk about other cultural events. And again, that's something that we wouldn't have dreamed of 20 years ago. Even the universities that were welcoming to LGBTQ students wouldn't have thought about being that forward. And it's been a really great opportunity. Part of the challenge is always, how do you find these students? You know, there's a lot of things that in high school where we get demographic information about students. This is usually not a demographic piece of information that we have. So giving that nod to students that we are a welcoming campus is a good way for them to reach out to us. Another great way is to partner with the organizations in your community and around. For those of you that have a broader or a national base from which to pull, think about how you do outreach with other Pride celebrations outside of your own city. So do you do a booth at other Pride celebrations around the state or around the region? Do you do partnerships and college nights with the LGBTQIA plus student groups in your area or youth groups in your area? Do you partner with those organizations to think about resources? So even if it's somebody that's not going to your institution, you're still providing them an opportunity to learn about completing a FAFSA, learn about scholarship opportunities, and learn about which schools are really positive for that population. Think about what opportunities you have around campus or college fairs. One of the really great organizations that I recommend everybody look up is a group called Campus Pride. Campus Pride has been a great partner, again, with AACRAO over the years. And they are an organization specifically dedicated to raising awareness of LGBTQ plus students in higher education. Many of the folks with that organization actually got their start in admissions. So they're very near and dear to us, a lot of student affairs professionals. And one of the things that they've really done is help create some best practices. There's a lot of toolkits. There's a lot of advice on their website that talk about what you can do at your own institution. But one of the other really nice things they've done is created opportunities for institutions to come together in an LGBTQ plus focus college fair. And they do these around the country. You can actually see where the ones coming up for this year are. And if you're not already participating in those, that's a great opportunity to get your visibility out there, a great opportunity to really increase your brand. And by default, it also forces the issue that you start to think about what your materials are, what your message is, what your value proposition of why somebody should choose you as their college. This has been really great because it's also a wonderful opportunity to engage with parents and really think about, are you providing a safe and welcoming place for their child to go off to college? So again, it's a really, really great opportunity around that. Some of the things that you really want to think about is, do you have an inclusive application and are your processes inclusive? One of the things that I really encourage everybody to do is ask sexual orientation on your application. Ask gender identity on your application. Those are really important things for two reasons. One is because you asking that question is a nod that you have thought about that you're an accepting institution, that you're going to do something with it. The second reason it's important is because do something with it. Whether that something is you're providing that information to an LGBTQ plus resource center, or that you're providing information that you internally or with your institutional research office can start to track and monitor students. Think about how often we monitor specific populations of students. For example, we monitor first generation students to think about, are we recruiting a larger number of first gen students every year? Are our first generation students retaining at the same rate? Are they graduating at the same rate? You can do that same thing with the LGBTQ plus community to think about, are there areas that you need to focus on? Are there challenges within this community that you're not addressing, and to really start to hone in on what those are and to really compare it to the larger community like you would other populations. I provided a link here, and at the end, I'll actually pop this back into the chat. But it is a link that takes you to AACRAO's resource page on transgender records. We did a really wonderful report a couple of years ago on working with transgender students from a record standpoint, and it gave some really great recommendations on the nuts and bolts types of questions like, what gender identity category should I use? What gender category should I use? How should I stage the questions? So it gives you all of those really great nuts and bolts. One of the other things I always want to make sure people think about, though, is as you're collecting this data and as you start to become a more welcoming university, think about your holistic admissions process. One of the things that you want to make sure that you've done is had implicit bias training and reducing implicit bias training, and specifically calling out LGBTQ plus issues, because one of the things that we're starting to see more and more often, especially in the essay scenario, is students are reflecting on that experience or on something that they had in their high school. And just to lay it bare, what some of our implicit bias ends up being is we often don't read our own applications. So some institutions are short-staffed and it's the territory managers and the road warriors that are reading every app. In some cases, it's the admissions director that's reading every app, but a lot of institutions farm that out. And you may bring in temporary employees, you may bring in retirees, and it may be people that aren't living that culture piece in an everyday way that your admissions advisors are or your admissions counselors are. So be cognizant of that, that it may be somebody that just dropping in once a year for a few months to help you read applications. Or it could be a case where you've got faculty readers reading applications. Make sure that they're thinking about LGBTQ plus issues as you think about implicit bias. One of the other things to think about is, how are you supporting your students? So do you have things like scholarships available for LGBTQ students as a recruitment opportunity, but also as an intervention opportunity to make sure that they're successful? Are you providing opportunities like student organizations, like support centers? Do you have an LGBTQ plus living learning centers? And then also, how are you integrating that to the larger campus? So are you providing things like training? Is this part of your inclusivity training across campus? Do you have safe zone training across campus? And really thinking about how does that play into what you're doing? And then how do you continue to support your students? So are you doing welcome week events specific to LGBTQ students to make sure that they know about all of the resources that you have available? Are you including things in your orientation programs? Are you providing opportunities through the year to engage, things like LGBTQ History Month, things like an alternative spring break? And then are you celebrating successes? One of the things that I think is the greatest thing that universities do is the rainbow graduation ceremony, because it's a great opportunity to celebrate student successes. And we've done that at our institutions with so many unique communities. And sometimes it's individual majors that are doing that. So all of the nurses doing their own individual program for graduation, or a college, or a fraternity and sorority. And being able to recognize that group of LGBTQ students is really important, because it's affirming, but it also is a great reminder of kind of why you're here and all of the things that you're doing. So that's a little bit about some of the resources that are out there, some of the things you should be doing. Again, I'll drop the resource of the Transgender guidebook from AACRAO into the chat, so you have that. We wanted to open it up and give you an opportunity to do some questions. From a formatting standpoint, if you would like to raise your hand, Mike Sisson will unmute you so you can ask your question live.
And Steve, you said you wanted to address a question, the Q&A there?
Yes, thanks, Mike. Yeah, there were a couple of questions that came up that I just wanted to comment on, to expand upon. So one of them was that someone had mentioned in the chat that the A in LGBTQIA plus didn't stand for ally, but that it stood for asexual, and that was a common misconception. So thank you for pointing that out. What I was referring to in our description was what we had chosen at AACRAO for the LGBTQIA plus caucus. When I took over from Jack was the chair of the LGBT. He was actually chair of the LGBT caucus, right? So when I became chair of the LGBT caucus, that was for a couple of years, and then we actually had that discussion that someone brought to us to the caucus, saying that we really needed to expand upon that. So we had a discussion about what letters to include and how to really format that. And we actually chose the A for ally because we had some people there that were allies that came regularly to the LGBTQ or the LGBT caucus at the time. And we wanted to recognize them for all of the help that they had given to us, and really recognize the importance that allies play in supporting the LGBTQ plus community. So that's why we chose ally. But like you said, there are many different variations on different campuses and different organizations across the country that mean different things. The other question that I wanted to address came up in the Q&A about polysexual. So and as I mentioned, right, there are many ways that people can identify, and we couldn't really touch on all of them. But yes, this one is one that I think kind of is similar to, but should not be confused with bisexual. Bisexual, in its former sense, meant only attraction to two genders, to both genders, because we were only in the old days, right? We used to recognize male and female in a binary world, and bisexual meant that. But then as we grew to identify and recognize other identities, bisexual meant just attraction to any two identities. Polysexual, in its true sense of the word, represents attraction to more than two. But sometimes nowadays, I think a lot of people use the term bisexual interchangeably with polysexual. That they use bisexual to mean just attraction to two or more genders. But polysexual in its true sense means attraction to multiple genders.
Great, thanks for the clarification there. Michael Sessa has a question here. Are data systems capturing LGBTQIA info?
Some. So one of the things that we're starting to see is that more and more systems are adding the opportunity for gender identity. And I think we will see something around sexual orientation probably in the next few years with systems. To be honest, one of the things that has been really great from an AACRAO standpoint is, as you know, we've been really active in the transgender community, especially because we felt like that was a community that was frankly getting ignored in some ways from an education standpoint and kind of getting left behind. And we chose that as a priority a few years ago from a board and organization standpoint. And one of the things we were able to do is work with a number of the vendors like Common App and get Common App on board to start asking sexual orientation and to start giving a broader opportunity for identifying both gender and gender identity. And one of the nice things about that is that frankly, that was a little bit of a politics game. Because so many universities are using Common App, there's a point where so many universities now have that data literally with no place to put it. So that's really forcing the downstream at some point for the student systems to also recognize that. Another question I saw come through was a little bit about legislation and some other things. I'll call out a couple of things on legislation in some of the kind of political pieces. One, keep watching the Department of Ed, the US Department of Ed. One of the things that they just announced at the end of last week, I believe it was the Office of Civil Rights identified that sexual orientation and gender identity are protected as, in their minds, protected as part of Title IX. They didn't elaborate on what that meant, but that's a really big important step because that is kind of returning to a recognition of that from a policy standpoint for the Department of Ed. We had about 4 years where they had moved away from that, and now that's a symbol that they're moving back. Where that could be really relevant is the second piece, which is a number of states have started to essentially outlaw transgender students competing on the teams with their appropriate gender. And as we start to see those new legislations and new laws crop up around the country, it signals that there's probably really, really soon going to be a collision between the Department of Ed's view of that and individual states' views of that. And that will probably force the issue to go through the courts a lot sooner than it might have otherwise. And also takes a little bit of the burden off of individual plaintiffs to fight that battle on their own. Because now you'll still need individual plaintiffs, but you'll probably have individual plaintiffs with the Department of Ed filing an amicus brief in your favor. So that's going to be really important as we move forward. Thinking about what that means is for all of you in those states that are starting to see that legislation crop up, this is an opportunity for you to get active and to step up, because that is a really, really important part of education, is the access to sports. For many people, that is the opportunity for a doorway into higher education, into funding their higher education. So that is not just an intramural recreational extra kind of thing. It can be a yes or a no, do you go to college opportunity for a number of students. So.
I also see a question on there about communication plans, so I wanted to address that one. The question is, how do we address communication plans so that we don't inadvertently out someone to their parents if they're not out at home? So the way our university, I'm from Adelphi University on Long Island, and the way that our university has handled that is we've set up on their profile page where they can go online and tell us if they have a preferred name. They can tell us the pronoun that they use. And then there's also a checkbox, and it explains that we will only use the legal name on mailings at home, but there's a checkbox where they can change that to tell us that they would like us to use their preferred name on mailings home. So we allow that, we ask the students to make that choice when they are identifying a preferred name.
Well, we can hang on a little bit longer, but we know that some people probably have a hard stop at the hour. So we want to thank everybody. This has been really wonderful. We've had a really great response today, and appreciate everybody having interest in this topic and playing a great role with AACRAO in moving this topic forward.
Yeah, thanks to you, Jack. And yeah, if you are both fine continuing, there are the 2 more questions there. I guess I'll just start with Sarira's. Any word on iPads updates to the binary gender categories? Maybe an add to the AACRAO policy agenda.
Yeah, so some of you know this already. So at the end, and I hate to play politics, but this is going to come out, as we go through it, just because of the timing. But at the end of the Obama administration, a lot of you know that I served on a small panel that actually made recommendations around a pretty significant change in how we would work with gender. And it was basically that the expectation would be that iPads would collect both gender and gender identity. And we went so far as to say that the gender should hardly ever be used. And that when we start thinking about things like longitudinal reports and things like that, we should be reporting on gender identity. So rather than saying how many males or how many females are at an institution, it would be how many men, how many women, how many trans men, how many trans women, things like that, within some reasonable amount of granularity. So that was a pretty strong recommendation that that our group made to the Secretary of Education, who carried that up to the president. That frankly got shelved as the new administration came in. We have not yet heard whether or not that will get dusted off or whether or not some similar group will get reconvened. I am hopeful based on the guidance that or the opinion that came out last week from the Department of Ed that there may be some movement around that. So I also saw a note on Supreme Court. I don't even begin to have a guess on where that would go. The transgender sports issue would go if it went to the courts. Because again, you would think that it would automatically fail because the court is more conservative than it was a few years ago. But based on some of the opinions we've seen more recently, there seems to be a 3-3-3 split on the court versus a 6-4, a 6-3 split, which is what they had expected based on the political background. So I think that we'll just have to wait and see.
Great, and I just put in the the typed answer to it, but the gender identity report that Jack referred to earlier should have some very good recommendations and workable solutions around updating the wording to collecting gender information. But I don't know if Jack or Steve, if you have anything to add beyond referring to that gender identity report.
Yeah, I would say that the great thing about that report and the structure of it, and actually AACRAO has kind of adopted this structure on some of the other task force reports we've done, is that it didn't identify a right or wrong answer. And it didn't always just identify what you would typically think of as a best practice. What we tried to identify was a good, better, best. So it was really an opportunity for institutions to think about where they are. And we left a little bit of growth room to be able to evolve over time. And little things like the example that Steve mentioned of the good example would be just start collecting a preferred name. Steve's example is in the best scenario where you're also giving students the opportunity to decide when and where that name gets used. And kind of the best ends up being able to do that with granularity.
Great, that looks like that is all the questions answered. Well done. So yeah, thanks for attending, everybody. I just want to shout out Jack and Cassandra and Steve again. Thanks to all of you for the work you've done on this and for helping everybody out today.
Yeah, thank you.
Good seeing everyone.